Good Lord. What a pain in the booty. All right, boys and girls, I hope you can all, boys and girls, and of course, anybody non binary, don't want to be prejudicial here. Hope you can all hear me. I think I'm back on. I think I've got it figured out. This always happens on Saturday morning, or Sunday morning, late Saturday night, that I turn this thing on and discover something has changed some horrible way that I wasn't aware of. I'm still not quite sure what happened here this time. Possibly just, I don't care. I don't care. Hi. Good to see you. It's me. It's Tad. I'm here. I'm going to be reading in just a few minutes. Let me just check in and see if anybody's here yet. And what's going on with that stuff. But yes, I am here. Who's checked in so far? A few folks. Christine. Hello, Christina. Good to see you. Hello. Good morning, Christina. And hello, Chris, who already said hello. And Kristen. We got Chris, Christina, and Kristen. And Mark, too. Hello, Mark. Good to see you. Anyway, Iris and several others. Who else? Maria Jose, Billy, and Penny have all checked in. And what other comments have I not seen? Oh, God, it's gotten rid of the comments for me. But I see Mahmoud has checked in. Oh, and my mother-in-law has checked in. Hello, Hazel. Good morning to you. Let me see. Wouter, hello. Anamika, hello. Carol, hello. And Debbie. Good to see you all. I won't bore you with any attempts to figure out why that happened or what exactly happened, because I don't know. It usually is some complication. The part of the other problem is that I've got a whole bunch of things plugged into the computer here, and sometimes a cable just goes, and until you've unplugged every single bloody cable and replugged them all, you don't know what it is that's gone wrong. So that's part of what I've been doing, and also just working with the software. I am very seriously thinking about changing software, so don't worry about that. I'm not going to go on like this forever. It's too maddening, but I think at this point I may have to wait until I finish the Dragonbone chair, because I'm going to want to test out new stuff and things like that. Anyway, anything to tell you besides hi, and I'm glad you're here. I'm down to my last two chapters, which is about a day's work of the first draft. So those of you who are in my list of designated victims, I'm going to be sending you those fairly soon. I have no idea why people are having problems with the page numbering. My page numbering seems to work. So it's not like there's no page numbering. It's that the page numbering is not showing up on other people's copies. And I have no idea. That gets into the vagaries of different computers and different word processing software, and the differences perhaps between, I don't know. I don't care. I don't care about anything technological at this point. What else to say? Not really much. Like I said, just been doing all that work and plugging away and just about finished, and planning on what I'm going to be doing afterward, which I don't really have any hard and fast information for you, so I won't bother you with speculation at this point. I know I need to finish the third. Originally, there were going to be five of them. The third volume of what's called the Tinker Farm in Germany, and what is called Ordinary Farm in the English language versions. I need to finish that. Deb wrote a first draft of that, and it's been sitting there waiting for me for like 2 years for me to get to, just because I was caught up in all the Ostenard stuff. Let me see what else. Everybody else is pretty much okay. There's no new news to report about anything. Just my ongoing struggle with streaming. The struggle with streaming. There's the title of something. And that's really about it. So, I think I might just jump into reading since I've already wasted a bunch of the show fiddling around with things. And there's probably lots of you out there thinking that I wasn't even going to make it on tonight and gave up on me already. So, yeah, Suzanne and Julian and Nicole and all the other people who showed up later, you didn't miss anything. You missed a dark nothing, a void, a phantom void while I was trying to get things started here because I actually was down here quite early tonight. I was down here about 12:20, so I've been messing with things from 12:20 till I finally got it on about 1:10. So that shows you how much fun I've been having. But anyway, enough of my complaining, enough of my old man miseries. So I'm going to be reading, and I think I'll just start that now because, as I said, I don't really have a lot to say. Nothing bad, good, indifferent to relate, just the usual. Just been working this week and dealing with life in all its interesting complexity. So I am going to just jump right back into the book. And in the book, we have been following Simon and Benebik and the Scythi and the others as they have passed, as they have climbed up into Irmsheim, the mountains, in search of the lost sword Thorn. So that's where we're going to be reading, and that's where we're going to start. And I think I'm going to go back a little bit. Let me see what I've read. Yeah, we just finished the part where Jiriki, they were camping on the mountainside, in the very, very cold mountainside. And to sort of cheer Simon up, and because Jiriki found out that Simon was able to see something in Jiriki's witness, Jiriki then, kind of as a gift to Simon, shows him an image of Enkie Shaosaye, the Scythi city, in its heyday, which is long in the past. So that's where I think we were. So that's what I'm going to continue from right around there. So here we go. Oh, let me just go back to this, but let us not end the stream because that would be a mistake, and we've made that mistake in the past, and it was not a good mistake. Okay, so that should make it harder to do. I just adjusted some things on my screen. The rest of the climb up Irmsheim, 3 more days on narrow, dangerous pathways, scarcely more than ice ribbons, over sheer glassy sheets by laboriously hacked hand and footholds. 2 more nights of evil, teeth-grinding cold passed by Simon like a fleeting but painful dream. Through the terrible weariness that beset him, he held on to Jiriki's gift of summer, for it was a gift, he knew, and was comforted. Even as his numb fingers struggled to cling and his numb feet to stay on the path, he thought that somewhere there would be warmth again, and something like a bed and clean clothes, even a bath would be welcome. All those things were out there somewhere, if he could just keep his head down and get off the mountain alive. When you stop to think about it, he reflected, there weren't many things in life one truly needed. To want too much was worse than greed. It was stupidity, a waste of precious time and effort. The company slowly worked their way around the body of the mountain until the sun rose each morning to shine over their right shoulders. The air was growing painfully thin, forcing frequent halts for the catching of breath. Even hardy Jiriki and uncomplaining Anai were moving more slowly, limbs weighted as though by heavy garments. The human companions, except for the troll, positively dragged. Grimrick had revived, thanks to the potency of Benebik's Canuck elixir, but shivered and coughed as he climbed. From time to time, the wind increased, sending the clouds that hugged Ermsheim's shoulders flying like tattered ghosts. The mountain's silent neighbors would slowly materialize, jagged peaks holding lofty convention far above the surface of Ostenard, indifferent to the sordid and minuscule landscape at their feet. Benebek, as comfortable breathing the insubstantial air of the roof of the world, as he had been sitting in Nagleman's pantry, pointed out wide, craggy Mintahuk in the east to his gasping companions, as well as several of the other mountains compassing the troll fells of Ykanuk. They came upon it suddenly, while fully half the mountain's height still towered above them. Struggling over a rocky outcropping, the rope pulled taut as a bowstring between them, every breath burning their lungs. They heard one of the Scythi, who had climbed ahead and out of sight, let out a strange whistling cry. The companions scrambled toward the top with all possible haste. The question of what they were hurrying toward dangled unspoken. Benebek, leading the line, stopped on the hill crest. He swayed a little to keep his balance. "Daughter of the mountains!" the troll gasped, a plume of vapor rising from his mouth. He stood and did not move for long moments. Simon carefully mounted the last few steps. At first he saw nothing before him but another wide valley of snow, its white wall rising across from them, open on the right to the air and sky, and a succession of snowy cliffs that dropped away down the side of Ermsheim. He turned to Benebek to ask him what made him cry out. The question died on his lips. On the left hand, the valley dug deep into the mountain's face, the valley floor sloping up as its high walls gradually angled together. At their apex, stretching up from the ground to the triangle of gray-blue sky, loomed the Uden tree. "Alicia, Mother of God!" Simon said, his voice cracking. "Mother of God!" he repeated. At first, confronted by the vast, mad implausibility of the thing, he thought it was a tree, a titanic tree of ice, 1,000 feet tall, myriad branches sparkling and coruscating in the noonday sun, shadowed at its impossible summit by a halo of mist. It was only as he finally convinced himself it was real, that such a thing could exist in a world that also contained such mundane objects as pigs and fences and mixing bowls, that he began to understand what it was. A frozen waterfall, the accumulation of years of icy snowmelt captured in a million icicles, a crystalline tracery down the jagged stone spine that formed the Uden tree's trunk. In case I forget to mention this later, I'm going to pop in here for just a second and mention, when I was writing this book, I thought I was inventing something or had fantasized something, namely this Uden tree, this frozen waterfall effect, looking like a giant tree made of ice. I found out a few years after the book came out that, in fact, there are such things. I was in the barber shop or somewhere where I used to go back in those days, and picked up a National Geographic or something like that. I think it was either a Smithsonian or a National Geographic. And there was a picture of a giant frozen waterfall, and it did, in fact, look like a gigantic tree made of ice. I was so pleased with myself. Anyway, Jariki and Anai stood transfixed a few ells below the valley floor, staring up at the tree. Simon, following Benebek, began struggling down the slope toward them, feeling the rope around his waist grow tense as Grimrick reached the summit and was himself struck motionless. Simon then waited patiently as the process was repeated 2 more times for Hastan and Sludig. At last, they all made their stumbling, preoccupied way down to the deep snow of the valley floor. The Scythi were quietly singing and paid no heed to the arrival of their human companions. For a long while, no one spoke. The majesty of the Uden tree almost seemed to suck the breath from their bodies, and for a great span of time, the companions just stood and stared, feeling emptied. "Let must be going forward, Benedict said at last. Simon started resentfully. The troll's voice seemed a rude intrusion. "'Tis the damnedest sight my eyes have ever held," Grimrick stuttered. "Here, old black one, I climb to the stars," Sludig said quietly. "God save me from blasphemy, but I can feel his presence still." Benedict started out across the open valley floor. The others followed after a few moments, tugged along by the troll's harness rope. The snow was thigh-deep and slow-going. After they had moved some 30 difficult steps, Simon finally tore his eyes from the spectacle to look back. Anai and Jiriki had not joined them. The two Sithis still stood side by side as if waiting for something. They moved forward. The valley walls leaned ever closer above their heads as though fascinated by these rare travelers. Simon could see that the base of the ice tree was a huge, jumbled, hole-dotted rockery, sheltered beneath the arching lower branches. Not true branches, but rather layer upon spreading layer of melted and refrozen icicles, each one wider than the one above, so that the bottommost branches made a ceiling half as wide as a tourney field over the strew of boulders. They had come close enough that the great ice pillar seemed to extend through the very roof of the sky. As he bent his neck painfully for one last glimpse at the near-vanished peak of the tree, a rush of surprise and fear ran over him, blackening his sight for a moment. The tower! From my dreams, the tower with branches! Stunned, he tripped and tumbled into the snow. Haystan reached down a broad hand and lifted him, without a word. Simon chanced another look up, and a frightening sensation that was more than mere dizziness sluiced over him. "Benedict!" he cried. The troll, just passing into the violet darkness of the Uden tree's shadow, turned swiftly. "Quiet, Simon!" he hissed. "We have no knowing if we may knock sharp ice loose, much to our regret." Simon made his way forward through the clinging snow as quickly as he could. "Benedict, this is the tower I dreamed. A white tower with branches like a tree. This is it." The troll surveyed the clutter of huge boulders and shattered rock in the tree's dark underside. "I thought it was your belief you saw Green Angel Tower from the Hayholt." "I did. That is to say, it was part of both. But since I'd never seen this before, I didn't know that some of it was some of this. Do you understand?" Benedict cocked a bushy black eyebrow. "When we are next finding time, I will cast the bones. Now we have a mission, still unperformed." He waited until the others had straggled up before speaking again. "It is my thought," he said at last, "that we should be soon making a camp. Then we can spend the last hours of daylight hunting for some sign of Coleman's company or the sword Thorn." Are them," Haystan indicated the now distant Scythy, "going to help?" Before Benedict could voice an opinion, Grimrick whistled excitedly and pointed up at the jumble of rocks. "Look you," he said. "I think there's been someone staying here before. Look at the rocks up there." Simon followed the soldier's finger to a spot farther up the sloping pile of rocks where several rows of stones had been piled in the mouth of one of the cave-like holes. "You're right," Haystan exclaimed. "He's right. Sure as Tuna's bones lie north to south, someone's made themselves a camp there." "Careful," Benedict said urgently, but Simon had already shed his harness and was making his way up the scree, setting off tiny avalanches where he stepped incautiously. He reached the cave in short moments and stood teetering on a loose stone. "This wall was made by men, that's certain," he called back excitedly.
The cavern mouth. The cavern mouth was perhaps 3 ells wide, and somebody had hurriedly, but not unskillfully, set rock to rock across the front. To keep in warmth, perhaps, to keep out animals. "Kindly do not shout, Simon," Benedict said. "We will be up directly with you." Waiting impatiently, all thoughts of thin air and killing cold in abeyance, Simon watched the company climb after him. Even as Haystand began his clamber up the pile, the 2 Scythi appeared beneath the eaves of the Uden tree. After taking in the scene for a moment, they mounted up to the cave as nimbly as branch-leaping squirrels. It took a moment for Simon's eyes to adjust to the more profound darkness inside the low cavern. When he could finally see, it took only a moment more for his eyes to widen with shock. "Benedict, it's there." The troll, able to stand upright at his side where Simon crouched, brought the heel of his hand against his breastbone. "Kinkipa," he said. "They have been waiting for our coming." The cave was scattered with the brown bones of men. The skeletons, naked but for fittings and jewelry of corroded black and green metal, sat propped against the cavern's walls. A thin layer of ice covered everything, like preserving glass. "Is it Coleman?" Simon asked. "Euthyris, save us!" Sludig choked behind him. "Get out! The air must be poison!" "There is no poison here," Benedict chided him. "As to whether it is Sir Coleman's party, the chances seem to me good." "It is interesting to wonder how they might have died." Jariki's voice was startlingly resonant in the small cavern. "If they froze, why did they not huddle together for warmth?" He indicated the scattering of the bodies about the chamber. "If they were killed by some animal or each other, then why are the bones arranged so carefully, as if each lay down to die in turn?" "There are mysteries here worth much talking, some day," the troll responded. "But we have other duties, and light is failing fast." "All of you," Sludig said, his voice strained with some terrible urgency. "Come here! Here!" He stood over one of the skeletons. Although the bones had collapsed into a madder-colored heap, still it had the look of someone caught in the act of prayer, kneeling with arms outstretched. Between the bones of its 2 hands, which lay half submerged in ice, like stones in a bowl of milk, was a long bundle wrapped in frosted, rotting oilcloth. All the air suddenly seemed to leak out of the cavern. A taut, deadening silence fell on the company. The troll and the Rimmersman kneeled as if in imitation of the ancient bones and began chipping away at the frozen bundle with their ice axes. The oilcloth came away in chips, like bark. A long strip splintered away to reveal a profound blackness beneath. "It's not metal," said Simon in disappointment. "Nor is Thorn made of metal," Benedict grunted, "or of no metal you have ever been seeing." Sludig was able to wiggle the point of his axe in beneath the petrified cloth, and with Haystand's straining help, they tore loose another strip. Simon gasped. Benedict was right. This thing, emerging like a jet-black butterfly from its prisoning chrysalis, was not only a sword, it was a sword like no other he had ever seen. Long as a man's arms spread wide, fingertip to fingertip, and black. The purity of its blackness was unmarred by the colors that sparkled on its edge, as though the blade was so supernaturally sharp that it even sliced the dim light of the cavern into rainbows. Had it not been for the silver cord wrapped around the hilt as a hand grip, leaving the uncovered guard and pommel as pitchy as the rest of its length, It would have seemed to bear no relationship to mankind at all. Rather, despite its symmetry, it would have seemed some natural growth, some pure essence of nature's blackness, extruded by chance in the form of an exquisite sword. "Thorn," Benedict whispered, a sort of reverence coloring his satisfaction. "Thorn," Jariki repeated, and Simon could not even try to guess the thoughts behind his naming of the thing. "So this is it, then," Sludig said at last. "It is a beautiful thing. What could kill them with such a blade in their possession?" "Who can know what happened to Coleman?" Benedict said. "But even a sword like Thorn you cannot eat when there is being no food." They all continued to stare at the blade. Grimrick, who was closest to the cave mouth, at last straightened out his crouch, hugging himself with thin arms. "As the troll says, you can't eat swords. I'm going to make fire for the night." He stepped outside the cavern and stood, stretching. He whistled a little. The tune, weak at first, grew stronger. "There's scrub brush in the rock crevices that might burn with our kindling," Sludig called after him. Haystan leaned forward, then touched the black blade with a cautious finger. "Cold?" he smiled. "No surprise that, is't?" He turned to Benedict, oddly diffident. "May I lift it?" The troll nodded. "Carefully." Haystan slipped his fingers gently under the cord-wrapped hilt and pulled, but the sword did not move. "Frozen?" he guessed. He tugged again, harder, with no better result. "Frozen up hard 'tis," he panted, pulling now with all his might. His breath rose in a cloud. Sludig leaned over to help him. Grimrick, outside the cavern, stopped whistling and said something unintelligible. As the Rimmersman and the Erkenlander both heaved, the black sword at last began to move, but rather than snapping free of prisoning ice, the blade merely slid a little to one side, then stopped. "It is not frozen," Sludig gasped. "It is as heavy as a millstone. We two together can barely move it." "How will we get it down the mountain, Benedict?" Simon asked. He wanted to laugh. It was all so silly and strange. To find a magic sword and then not be able to carry it away. He reached his own hand forward and felt the deep, cool weight of the thing. And something else. A warming? Yes, some indefinable life beneath the cold surface, like a sleeping serpent stirring into wakefulness. Or was he imagining things? Benedict stared at the immobile blade and scratched his shaggy hair, thinking. A moment later, Grimrick appeared in the cavern, waving his arms. As they turned to look at him, he slumped to his knees, then toppled over, limp as a sack of meal. A black arrow, a thorn of a different sort, quivered in his back. Next section. By the way, let me just quickly check. Make sure we're still connected. Oh, yeah, that's right. I had to disconnect that part. Okay, we're still on. There we go. Blue light bathed the silver mask, touching its contours with pale fire. The face beneath had once been the model for its sculpted, inhuman beauty, but what the mask now covered, no living creature could say. The world had made uncountable revolutions since the face of Utuku had disappeared forever behind its gleaming lines. The blue-brushed mask turned and surveyed the giant, many-shadowed stone hall, eyeing her scurrying servitors as they labored to do all that she had bid them. Their voices were raised in songs of praise and remembrance. Their white hair fluttered in the eternal winds of the chamber of the harp. She listened with approval, as the clatter of witchwood hammers echoed through the endless maze of corridors riddling frozen Nakiga, the mountains Norns called Mask of Tears. The mortals called her home Stormspike, and Utuku knew that it haunted their dreams, as it should. The silver face nodded, satisfied. All was in readiness. Suspended in the mist that crowned the great well, the harp suddenly moaned, a desolate sound like wind in the high passes. The Norn Queen knew it was not his voice, not he who could make the breathing harp sing and howl, not he whose wrathful song sent the entire well chamber thundering with impossible musics. Some lesser voice was crawling through the harp, trapped in its infinite complexities like an insect in a sealed maze. She lifted a silver and white-gloved finger mere inches above the black stone of her chair and made a small gesture. The moan became louder, and something quivered into substantiality in the fog above the well. The gray sword Jingizu, pulsing with painful light. Something held it, a shadowy figure, its hand a formless knot around Jingizu's hilt. Utuku understood. She did not have to see the supplicant. The sword was there, far more real than any mortal temporarily allowed to possess it. "Who comes before the queen of the Hekedaya?" she asked, knowing the answer full well. "Elias, High King of Ostenard," the shadowy figure replied. "I have decided to accept the terms of your master." The word master nettled her. "Mortal," she said at last with queenly languor, "what you wish will be given to you. But you have waited long, almost too long." "There were..." The shadowy thing holding the sword swayed as if weary. How fleshy, how weak these mortals were. How could they have caused such damage? "I thought," it continued, "that things would be different. Now I submit." "Of course you do. And you shall receive what was promised to you." "Thank you, O Queen, and I shall give you what I have promised in return." "Of course you will." She lowered her gloved fingers, and the apparition vanished. Red light bloomed deep in the well as he came. As he took possession of it, the harp vibrated to a note of perfect triumph. "I don't want to die," Grimrick wheezed. A froth of blood on his chin and cheek, his crooked teeth standing in his gaping mouth, he looked like a hare caught and savaged by hounds. It's so bloody cold," he shivered. "Who did it?" Simon squeaked, losing control of his voice in shock and panic. "Whoever," Haystan muttered, ashen-faced as he bent over his stricken countrymen. They got us like Coney up a plug hole." "We must get out," Sludig snapped. Wrap cloaks around arms," Benedict said, assembling his blowpipe from the pieces of his walking stick. "We are having no shields against arrows, but that will be some help." Without a word, Jariki stepped over Haystan and the fallen Grimrick, moving toward the mouth of the cave. Anai, tight-lipped, followed. "Prince Jariki," Benedict began, but the Scythe paid no heed. "Come then," Sludig said. "We cannot let them go out alone." He snatched up his blade from the cloak where he had set it. Even as the others followed the Scythe to the cave mouth, Simon looked down at the black sword Thorn. They had come such a long way to find it. Were they to lose it now? What if they escaped but were cut off from the cavern and could not come back? He put his hand on its hilt again and again felt the strange thrumming sensation. He tugged, and to his amazement it came up in his hand. The weight of it was tremendous, but using 2 hands he was able to lift it off the frozen cave floor. What was happening here? He was dizzied. 2 strong men could not lift it, but he could? Magic? Simon cautiously carried the long, achingly heavy blade to where his companion stood. Hastan untied his cloak, but instead of wrapping it around his arm for protection, he laid it gently over Grimrick. The wounded man coughed, bringing up more blood. Both Erkenlanders were crying. Before Simon could say a word about the sword, Jariki strode out from the cave mouth onto the rocky porch, cocky as a juggler. "Stand forward!" he shouted, and the icy walls of the valley sent the echoes tumbling back. "Who attacks the company of Jariki Isamsere, son of Shimaunari, and scion of the house of Year Dancing? Who would war on the Zidaya?" In answer, a dozen figures clambered down the sloping valley walls and stood 100 ells from the base of the Uden tree. All were armed. All wore glare masks and hooded white cloaks, and each bore on his breast the triangular badge of Stormspike. "Norns?" Simon gasped, forgetting for an instant the strange object cradled in his arms. "These are not Hikadaya," said Anai shortly. "They are mortals who do Utuku's bidding." One of the cloaked men took a limping, stiff-legged pace forward. Simon recognized the sunburned skin and pale beard. "Go away, Zidaya," Ingenjegger said. His voice was slow and cold. "The Queen's huntsman has no quarrel with you. It is those mortals cowering behind who have thwarted me, and who cannot be allowed to leave this place. They are under my protection, mortal man." Prince Jariki patted his sword. "Go back and sit beneath Utuku's table. You will get no scraps here." Ingenjegger nodded. "So be it." He waved a negligent hand, and one of his huntsmen swiftly drew his bow and loosed. Jariki sprang aside, pulling Sludig along, who had stood just at his back. The arrow shattered on a rock beside the cave mouth. "Down!" Jariki shouted, even as Anai let fly an arrow in return. The huntsmen scattered, leaving one of their company face down in the snow. Simon and his companions went skittering down the slippery rocks to the base of the ice tree as arrows hummed past. Within minutes, both sides' meager ration of arrows had been exhausted, but not before Jariki had feathered another of Ingen's raiders, putting a barb in the running man's eye as neatly as shooting an apple balanced on a stone wall. Nearby, Sludig was stricken in the fleshy part of his thigh, but the arrow had caromed off a stone first, and the rimmersman was able to pluck the head out and limp to shelter. Simon crouched behind a stone promontory, part of the Uden tree's trunk, cursing himself for leaving his bow and precious arrows in the cave. He watched as Anai, his own quiver exhausted, cast bow aside and pulled his slender dark sword from its sheath. The face of the Sitha was as implacable as if he had been mending fences. Simon was sure his own must be a mirror of his overwhelming inner fear, of his tripping heart and hollow stomach. He looked down at Thorn and felt a pulse of life in it. The heaviness had become different somehow, animate, as though it were full of rattling bees. It seemed a bound animal, stirring as it breathed the enticing sense of freedom. A short way to his left, on the far side of the stone trunk, Hastan and Sludig were slinking forward, using the great curving branches of ice for cover. Safe now from arrows, Ingen was gathering his huntsmen for a charge on the valley floor. "Simon!" a voice hissed. Startled, he turned around to see Binibik crouching on the stone prominence above his head. "What will we do?" Simon asked, trying to keep his voice level but not succeeding. The troll, however, was staring down at the black length of Thorn, nestled in Simon's arms like a child. How? How? Bennebec asked, his round face full of surprise. I don't know. I only picked it up. I don't know. What are we going to do? The troll shook his head. You are now to stay right here. I am going to help with what I can. I wish that I had a spear. He sprang down lightly, his heel spattering Simon with a flirt of gravel as he bounded past. For Joswell Lackhand! Hastan shouted and charged out from the eaves of the Uden tree onto the white valley floor, Sludig limping purposefully behind. As soon as they reached the deep snow, they slowed as if running in treacle. Ingun's huntsmen slogged toward them, performing the same halting, deadly dance. The same halting, deadly dance. Hastan swung up his heavy sword, but before he even reached the attackers, the first white-cloaked figure fell, clutching his throat. Ye Canok! Bennebec shouted in triumph and crouched to reload his blowpipe. The clang of swords reverberated as the first of Ingun's men reached Hastan and Sludig. The Scythi were there a moment later, moving nimbly over the snow, but still the companions were far outnumbered. A moment later, tall Hastan caught the flat of a blade on his hooded skull and went down in a puff of snow. Only Anai, leaping forward to stand over him, prevented his being skewered on the spot. Blades shimmered in the thin sunlight, and cries of pain and rage almost drowned the clash of metal. Simon saw with a sinking heart that Bennebec, whose remaining darts had proved useless against the thick cloaks of the huntsmen, was pulling his long knife from his belt. How could he be so brave? He's too small. They'll kill him before he can get close enough to use it. Bennebec! He shouted and climbed to his feet. He lifted the heavy black sword over his head, feeling its great weight dragging at him even as he stumbled forward. The ground suddenly pitched beneath his feet. He staggered, spread-legged, and then felt the very mountain seem to sway. A rumbling screech pierced his ears like the sound of a heavy stone dragged across a quarry. The combatants stopped, dumbfounded, and stared down at their feet. With another horrible shriek of tortured ice, the ground began to bulge in the center of the valley floor, only a few cubits from where Ingun Jaeger stood gaping in horrible confusion. A great slab of ice pushed upward, cracking and buckling as it came, snow sliding off in great drifts. Propelled by the sudden shifting of the ground beneath him, Simon tripped and tumbled forward, holding tightly onto Thorn, and came to a stop virtually in the middle of the combatants. No one seemed to notice him. They were all frozen in place, as if the very ice of the Uden tree had turned their blood to immobilizing frost, goggling at the impossible thing pushing its way up from beneath the snow. The ice dragon. A snake-like head as long as a man thrust out of the new-formed crevice, white-scaled above a toothy mouth, the staring eyes blue and occluded. It waved sinuously from side to side on its long neck, as though curiously observing the minute creatures who had awakened it from years-long slumber. Then, terrifyingly swift, it darted out and caught one of the huntsmen in its jaws, biting him in half and swallowing his legs. His crushed, bloodied torso fell into the snow like a discarded rag. "Igjarjuk! It is Igjarjuk!" came Bennebec's thin shout. The gleaming ivory head snapped up another shrieking, white-cloaked morsel. As the white feet gripped the crevice's rim and the dragon's long body, back covered with strange pale fur yellowed as old parchment, humped slowly up from below. A whip-like tail, long as a jousting run, swept two of the huntsmen wailing into the pit. Simon sat stunned upon the snow, unable to force belief in the monstrous thing that crouched on the rim of the ice crevice like a cat on a chair back. The long snouted head dipped to regard him, and the murky, unblinking blue eyes fixed his with calm, ageless malice. His head throbbed as though he tried to stare through water, those eyes hollow as glacial crevices. It saw him. It knew him in some way. It was as old as the bones of the mountains, as wise and cruel and uncaring as time itself. The jaws parted, and a sliver of black tongue knifed out, tasting the air. The head bobbed closer. "Skei, spawn of Hidohebi!" a voice shouted. An instant later, Anai had vaulted onto the creature's hindquarters, grasping the thick furs for support. Singing, he lifted his sword and hacked at a scaly leg. Simon got to his feet and stumbled back even as the dragon brought up its tail and smashed the Sitha away. Anai flew 50 cubits to land crumpled in the snow at the valley's exposed rim, nothing beyond him but mist. Jiriki ran after with a cry of anger and despair. "Simon!" the troll shouted. "Run! We can do nothing!" Even as he spoke, the mist that had enshrouded Simon's wits began to clear. In a moment he was on his feet, flying after Jiriki. Benebik, who had been perched on the crevice's far rim, flung himself backward as the dragon lashed out, and the great jaws snapped shut on nothing with a sound like an iron gate. The troll fell into a rift in the ice and disappeared. Jiriki huddled over the body of Anai, motionless as a statue. Pelting toward him, Simon looked back over his shoulder to see Igjarjuk slithering down from the broken battlement of ice and moving across the little valley, short legs gripping the ice as it wound along the ground, quickly narrowing the distance between itself and its stumbling prey. Simon tried to shout Jiriki's name, but his throat caught. All that came out was a strangled grunt. The Sitha turned around. His amber eyes were bright. He climbed to his feet beside the body of his comrade, holding his long, rune-carved witchwood sword up before him. "Come, old one!" Jiriki cried. "Come to me and taste Indreju, you bastard child of Hidohebi!" Simon grimaced as he dug toward the prince. No need to shout. The dragon was coming of its own accord. "Get behind!" Jiriki started to say as Simon reached him. Then the Sitha abruptly pitched forward. The snow beneath him had fallen away. Jiriki skidded backward toward the valley's edge and the empty distance beyond. Desperately, he reached out to grab at the snow. He stopped, clinging, his feet dangling over nothingness. Anai, a bloodied tangle, lay undisturbed a cubit away. "Jiriki!" Simon stopped. There was a noise like thunder behind. He whirled to see the vast white bulk of Igjarjuk bearing down, head flailing from side to side with the motion of the driving legs. Diving to one side, away from Jiriki and Anai, he rolled and came up on his feet. The blue saucer eyes tracked him, and the creature, now only 100 paces away, swerved to follow. Simon realized he was still carrying Thorn. He lifted it up. It was suddenly light as a willow wand and seemed to sing in his hands like wind-sawed rope. He glanced back over his shoulder. A few paces of ground was all, then empty air. One of the distant peaks hovered in the swirling mists across the chasm, white, quiet, serene. "Usiris saved me," he wondered. "Why doesn't the dragon make a sound?" His mind seemed to float loose inside his body. One hand stole up to Miriamel's scarf at his throat, and then he grasped the silver-wrapped hilt once more. Igjarjuk's head loomed, the gullet a black pit, the eye a blue lantern. The world seemed constructed of silence. What should he shout at the last? He remembered what Jiriki had once said of mortals. even as the frosty musk of the dragon blew down on him, a stench like sour, cold earth and wet stones. "Here I am!" he cried, and brought Thorn whistling toward the baleful eye. "I am Simon!" Something caught at the blade, and a gout of black blood spat at him, burning like fire, like ice, searing his face even as a great white something crashed through and carried him down into darkness. And look at that, it's 2 o'clock. And that's the end of the chapter. So that's where we're going to stop. I hope I'm still on. I hope, since I didn't want to go over and check because there were so many new factors involved tonight. But I think we stayed on, didn't we? Let me move that over there so I can see. Yeah, looks like it. Okay, or at least so I think. Anyway, so it is now 2 o'clock. We are going to wrap it up. Thank you for your patience. I'm glad we got back on. One of these days, I will figure all of this stuff out. But in the interim, I will keep reading. I think we've only really got, possibly I might finish tomorrow. Actually, I think I probably will finish tomorrow, but or later today. But don't go away. I'll be back next week, one way or the other. I don't know what I'll be doing, but as far as I know, I'll be back. But check in on my website or my Facebook page. So with that, I say thank you so much for joining me. Sorry we had a confusing start, but I'm glad we got through it all and got through the chapter and chapter 42 with the dragon and all that good stuff. And I just want y'all to keep taking care of yourselves, take care of your loved ones, take care of your friends and neighbors. I will continue to do what I do, which includes a great deal of taking care of people myself and animals and things. Again, I will be back at 7 p.m. to probably finish the book, but then I'll be back next weekend also, or I will make announcements otherwise. So, but that's what's going on. I hope all is going well for you, and I will talk to you very soon. So, cheers and peace.